What if one day you looked up at the sky and the sun wasn't our sun anymore? No warning, no countdown, no explosion in the sky. Just a different star suddenly sitting where our sun should be. At first, that might not sound like a huge deal. A star is a star, right? Not even close. A small change in brightness, mass, radiation, or distance can turn Earth into a frozen tomb, a boiling furnace, or something even worse. So today, we're going to replace our sun with other stars and see what would happen to our planet. In each case, we'll look at two versions of the scenario. First, what happens if Earth stays exactly where it is now? And second, what happens if we magically move Earth into the new star's habitable zone? And as you'll see, some of these stars don't need to explode to destroy us. Alpha Centauri b. Let's start with Alpha Centauri b. If Alpha Centauri b replaced our sun, Earth would receive about 50% less brightness. But interestingly, your eyes wouldn't notice as much as you'd expect. Human vision is extremely good at adapting to different light levels, so the world wouldn't suddenly look dark. It would feel more like a slightly hazy late afternoon. The sunlight would also look a little more orange, and if you looked directly at the star, you'd notice that it appeared slightly smaller. But the real change wouldn't be visual. It would be thermal. At Earth's current distance, receiving only half the solar energy we're used to would trigger an immediate apocalyptic cooling event. Within weeks, global temperatures would crash to around -70 degrees Fahrenheit. The oceans would begin to freeze over, continents would be buried in snow, and Earth would enter a runaway ice albedo feedback loop. As more of the planet became covered in bright white ice, more of the remaining starlight would be reflected back into space, making the planet even colder, which would then create even more ice. And it gets worse. Alpha Centauri b has only about 90% of the sun's mass. That means it would have less gravity holding Earth in its current orbit. Earth's existing momentum would push it farther outward, widening its orbit and dropping temperatures even more. In that version of events, agriculture would simply stop. Earth's surface would become a frozen, lifeless wasteland. The only surviving pockets of humanity would likely be the few people who managed to retreat into deep underground bunkers, relying entirely on geothermal and nuclear energy to stay alive. But now let's fix one thing. Suppose we magically move Earth inward, placing it safely inside Alpha Centauri b's habitable zone. The planet avoids the deep freeze, but that doesn't mean life goes back to normal. Because Earth would now be orbiting closer to a slightly less massive star, it would need to move much faster to remain in orbit. Our 365-day year would instantly shrink to about 225 days. Seasons would cycle about 40% faster. Farmers would suddenly face drastically shorter growing periods, and winter would arrive months earlier than expected. Global food systems would be thrown into chaos. Even if humanity adapted its calendars, plants would still struggle. Alpha Centauri b is cooler than our sun, so its light shifts away from bluer wavelengths and more toward the red and infrared part of the spectrum. Earth's crops evolved under our sun's specific light conditions, so yields would likely collapse until we genetically engineered food that could thrive under a more orange-tinted sky. And then there's the star itself. Alpha Centauri b is highly magnetically active. It frequently releases enormous amounts of X-rays and stellar flares. So while humanity is desperately trying to farm under a fast-moving orange-lit year, we'd also be dealing with repeated geomagnetic storms, damaged satellites, disrupted radio communication, and stressed electrical grids. We wouldn't freeze to death like in the first scenario, but surviving would require us to completely reinvent civilization. Proxima A, F-type star. Now let's replace the Sun with Proxima A, a brilliant, searing hot F-type star. Proxima A emits roughly 7 times more light and energy than our Sun. If Earth stayed at current distance, the sky would turn an intense, blinding white, and the global average temperature would soar to nearly 300 degrees Fahrenheit. The oceans would literally begin to boil. As water rapidly flashed into steam, Earth's atmosphere would spiral into a runaway greenhouse effect, trapping even more heat and turning the planet into a superheated Venus-like hellscape within weeks. And even if you could somehow survive the heat, the light itself would be deadly. Because Proxima A burns much hotter than our sun, it emits enormous amounts of ultraviolet radiation. That UV would shred Earth's ozone layer, permanently blind wildlife, and cause catastrophic cellular damage to anything exposed to daylight. So if humanity wanted to survive, Earth would need to be moved much farther away, roughly halfway into our current asteroid belt. At that distance, temperatures would finally become more stable, but life on this new Earth would feel deeply alien. First, daylight would no longer have the warm yellow tone we're used to. It would be harsh, brilliant, and cold white. Second, the calendar would be obliterated. Earth's new orbit would be much larger, and a single year would now last around 1,300 days. Because Earth's axial tilt would remain the same, the seasons would still exist, but each one would last about 10 or 11 months. Winter would no longer feel like a season. It would feel like a year-long endurance test. Human civilization would have to restructure agriculture on a global scale, stockpiling vast food reserves just to survive these extended super winters. But the real chaos would come at night. Proxima is not just one star, it's a binary system. Orbiting Proxima A is Proxima B, a dead, dense white dwarf in a highly elliptical orbit. At times, it would swing terrifyingly close to Earth's new position. During those close passes, Proxima B would appear in the night sky as an intense pinpoint of light, up to 5 times brighter than our full moon. And because it would be a sharp point rather than a large glowing disk, it would cast harsh, eerie shadows across the landscape. Its light would be unsettling. Its gravity would be worse. Proxima B is incredibly dense, and as it passed by, its gravity would tug violently on Earth. Every few decades, our orbit could be stretched and warped, creating wild and extreme climate swings, sudden ice ages followed by intense greenhouse periods. And even then, all of our efforts would only be temporary. Proxima A is already reaching the end of its stable hydrogen-burning phase and swelling into a subgiant. Over time, its heat output will continue to rise, which means the habitable zone will keep moving outward. So even at Earth's new distance, the oceans would eventually begin to boil again, forcing humanity to keep pushing the planet farther and farther into the dark just to stay alive. Kepler-16, a sub-binary world. Now let's move to something even stranger, Kepler-16, a binary star system. If Kepler-16 replaced our sun, the first sunrise would be breathtaking. You wouldn't see one star rising over the horizon, you'd see 2, a small orange sun and a dim red one. As they climbed into the sky, shadows from trees and buildings would split into 2 separate forks and slowly drift apart through the day. It would be beautiful. But you wouldn't have long to admire that. Kepler-16a and 16b are both small, dim stars, and together they produce only about 15.5% of the light our sun gives us. At Earth's current distance, that would trigger a planetary deep freeze. Global temperatures would plunge to nearly -135 degrees Fahrenheit. The oceans would freeze solid. The water cycle would stop. Within months, Earth would become a dead, frozen ice world. To keep the planet warm, we would have to move Earth inward, roughly to the distance of Mercury. And that's where things get weird. A year on this new Earth would shrink to just 94 days. But there would also be a second clock governing life on the planet. The 2 stars orbit each other every 41 days, and because their positions constantly shift, the amount of light reaching Earth would pulse on that same 41-day rhythm. So, on top of a 94-day year, the planet would also experience a repeating 41-day light season. Plants would be thrown into complete confusion. Their photosynthesis would be driven not just by seasons, but by this strange, repeating mini-season layered on top of the year. Animals that navigate by the sun would be equally disoriented, trying to track 2 separate stars constantly moving around each other. And then come the eclipses.
Every few weeks, one star would pass in front of the other. You could be walking outside and suddenly notice daylight dimming for around 6 hours. Sunsets would be even stranger. Because the two stars can separate in the sky, you could experience a true double sunset. The orange star dropping below the horizon first, leaving the world in a dim red twilight for an hour or two before the red dwarf finally sets. But there is a serious problem here. In astrophysics, a planet orbiting two stars has to stay far enough away to avoid their chaotic gravitational tug-of-war. For the Kepler-16 system, the safe zone begins at 0.63 astronomical units. But to keep Earth warm, we would have to place it at about 0.39 astronomical units. That puts Earth inside the gravitational danger zone. Its orbit would become unstable. Every 41 days, the shifting gravity of the two stars